The young men of the 30th Infantry Division lay in their holes along a sunken Normandy lane and listened to the sky fill up with engines. It was a sound like nothing else in the war, a low, grinding roar that started as a rumor on the horizon and grew until it pressed on the chest, until it was the whole world. They looked up and saw them, wave after wave after wave of heavy bombers, silver crosses against the summer haze, more aircraft than most of these men had ever seen in one place in their lives. And for a moment, lying in the dirt of the hedgerow country, they felt something close to gratitude. All that power was on their side. All of it was pointed the other way, at the Germans dug in a few hundred yards to the south. Then the first bombs came down short. They came down on the wrong side of the road. They came down in the orchards and the fields where American infantry waited to attack. The earth stood up in long walking rows of fire and steel, and the men who had just been grateful clawed into the ground and screamed for it to stop, and it did not stop, because there were more than 1,000 aircraft in that stream, and each one was following the one ahead of it, and the smoke and the dust had begun to drift back over the American lines so that the bombardiers above could no longer tell whose men were whose. When it was over, more than 100 Americans were dead and nearly 500 were wounded, cut down not by the enemy but by their own air force on the opening morning of the operation that would break the German army in France. And one of the dead was a lieutenant general. He was the highest-ranking American soldier lost in the entire European war. He had helped build the United States Army from the ground up. He was carrying a secret so important that the Allies had staked the survival of the invasion on it. And when a bomb from an American aircraft landed in his slit trench and threw his body across a Normandy field, the War Department told the American people that he had been killed by enemy fire. That was a lie. And the Army knew it was a lie when it said it. This is the story of how the United States Army killed one of its own most senior generals, along with more than 100 of its own soldiers, in the space of a single morning. It is the story of the decision that put those men under those bombs, the argument over who was to blame that two of America's most famous commanders carried to their graves, and the cover story the Army reached for in the first hours, and why. His name was Lieutenant General Lesley McNair, and the question this video is going to put in front of you is not a simple one. It is whether a victory this decisive can ever justify a price this high, paid this way, and whether the truth about how these men fell should have been buried with them. Let me start with the reputation, because you have to understand what the textbooks celebrate before you can understand what they leave out. Operation Cobra is remembered as a triumph, and by the cold arithmetic of the war, it was won. By the middle of July 1944, more than a month after the landings, the Allies were stuck. The Great Invasion had put more than 1 million men ashore, and then the front had congealed in the worst possible ground, the Normandy bocage, a country of ancient hedgerows grown on banks of packed earth, every field a walled box, every sunken lane a ready-made trench. The Germans turned that landscape into a killing floor. American infantry paid for it by the yard. In the fighting for the town of St. Lo alone, 3 divisions of one American corps lost more than 11,000 men in a couple of weeks, and in the worst sectors, the price ran close to 1 dead American for every meter of ground taken. What haunted the senior commanders that July was a memory older than any of them, the memory of the last war, of the trenches, of 4 years of men dying by the 100,000 to move a front line a few miles, and then move it back. There was a real and growing fear in the Allied camp that Normandy was becoming exactly that, a siege, a slaughterhouse with a fixed front, and that the whole invasion might bog down within sight of the beaches, while the Germans fed in reserves and the Allied public lost its patience. The pressure on Bradley to break the thing open and break it open fast was enormous, and it came from the very top. Hold that pressure in your mind, because it is the thing the defense will lean on hardest, and it is real. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, decided the only way out of the hedgerows was to stop grinding and start punching. He would mass everything on a narrow front west of St. Lo, along the straight road that ran to the town of Perrier, and he would open the door with the heaviest concentration of air power ever put over a battlefield in direct support of ground troops. Some 1,500 heavy bombers, hundreds of medium bombers, hundreds of fighter bombers, all of it dropped in about an hour onto a rectangle of German positions, barely a few thousand yards deep. The theory was simple: stun the defenders senseless, then pour the tanks and the infantry through the gap before they could recover. And it worked. That is the part the textbooks get right. The bombing shattered the German division in its path. The breakthrough became a breakout, and within a week, the whole German position in Normandy had come unhinged. Within a month, the Allies were racing for the German border, and Paris was about to fall. Martin Blumenson, who wrote the official United States Army history of this campaign, the volume called Breakout and Pursuit, treats Cobra as the hinge on which the entire Western campaign turned. He is not wrong. As for Lesley McNair, the man history mostly forgets, in 1944, he was one of the most important soldiers in the country. He commanded Army ground forces, which meant he was the architect of the American Land Army, the man responsible for organizing and training the divisions that were now fighting across France. He had already been wounded once at the front in Tunisia, watching his methods tested in combat, and he had the Purple Heart to show for it. He was known as a soldier's soldier, a trainer, a builder, a quiet and demanding professional. That is the surface. That is the reputation. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people, and it is the single biggest thing you can do to keep work like this going. Now, back to Normandy, and to the case against the men who planned this morning, because underneath the triumph, there's a prosecution to be made, and the evidence is damning. The first charge is the most basic one. The plan asked American bombers to drop their loads directly over the heads of American troops, and the men who made it knew, before a single aircraft took off, that this would get some of those troops killed. Here's the argument that decided it. Bradley wanted the bombers to fly parallel to the front line, to run laterally along the Perriers to St. Lo Road, so that any bombs falling long or short would at least fall along his lines rather than across them. The road was straight and unmistakable from the air, and it made a clean boundary. To Bradley, this was obvious, and he would insist for the rest of his life that he had been promised exactly that. The airmen saw it differently. A formation of 1,500 heavy bombers could not be funneled through the narrow end of that box and still put its bombs down in the hour the ground plan required. Flying parallel meant flying the long way along the German flak, exposed in a thin stream. Flying perpendicular, straight in from the north, over the American troops, was faster, safer for the crews, and the only way to get that much tonnage down in that little time. So the bombers would come in over the heads of the infantry, and the only protection for those infantry was distance, a strip of empty ground between the front line and the target that the bombs were not supposed to cross. The airmen wanted that strip to be 3,000 yards wide, and they said plainly that even 3,000 yards would not rule out gross errors. Bradley wanted it to be 800 yards because he wanted his men close enough to rush the stunned Germans before they recovered. 800 yards. In the words of the official history, 800 yards left no real margin of safety at all. They compromised in the end on 1,500 yards, which was less than half what the airmen had asked for. It is worth pausing on who was in that room, because the failure that killed these men was not one man's failure. The planning brought together the ground commanders under Bradley, the tactical air leaders including Major General Pete Casada, the medium bomber commanders, and above them the overall air commander for the invasion, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, along with the leaders of the strategic heavy bomber force that Bradley was borrowing for the day. These were not fools. They were among the most experienced air and ground officers the war produced. And they sat in a room together, argued the single most dangerous question in the plan, the direction the bombers would fly relative to the troops, and broke up without a firm, written, mutually understood answer. Each man left with the version that suited his own service's needs. The airmen assumed perpendicular, Bradley assumed parallel. Nobody forced the disagreement into the open and nailed it down, because nailing it down would have meant one side losing an argument it did not want to lose, and it was easier to leave it soft. That softness had a body count. Sit with that number for a moment, because, to my mind, it is the root of everything that followed. 1,500 yards is less than a mile. Bombs dropped from 15,000 feet, through cloud and haze and drifting smoke, by tired men squinting through a bomb site at a landscape already erased by dust, scatter far more than 1,500 yards. Everyone in that planning room knew it. The airmen said it out loud. And the plan went forward anyway, because the prize, the breakout, was judged worth the arithmetic. I want to be careful here and fair, and I will be when we get to the defense. But the prosecution's first point stands on its own. This was not a freak accident that no one could have foreseen. The danger was named in the room before the fact and accepted. The second charge is worse because the Army got a warning and ignored it. The attack was first set for the 24th of July. More than 1,000 heavy bombers took off from England, and then the weather over Normandy closed in. The air commander, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, flew across the channel, looked at the cloud, and ordered the whole thing called off. But the recall reached the bomber stream late, and by then part of it was already over the target. In the confusion, one lead bombardier had trouble with his release mechanism and let his bombs go, and 15 aircraft behind him dropped when he did, on reflex, because that is how formation bombing works. Those bombs fell about 2,000 yards north of the road, on the wrong side, on the 30th Infantry Division. 25 Americans were killed on the 24th of July. More than 130 were wounded. And this was the aborted attack, the one that was supposed to be called off. It was a live rehearsal of the exact disaster the airmen had warned about, and it wrote the warning in American blood a full day before the real attack. And look at how it happened, because the mechanism matters. The decision to recall the bombers was correct. The weather genuinely was too poor to bomb safely. But the recall order had to travel from Lee Mallory over Normandy back to a bomber stream already strung out across the sky over England and the Channel, and it did not arrive in time to stop everyone. Part of the force never got the word. Some crews, told to bomb only on a clear sighting of the target, could not see the ground and correctly held their loads. Others could not see it either and dropped anyway. The whole episode was a demonstration, if anyone had wanted to see one, of how little real control a headquarters had over 1,000 aircraft once they were committed and moving. The machine was too big and too fast to stop cleanly. That should have been the lesson of the 24th. Instead, the lesson the Army took away was simply to try the same thing again the next morning. And here is the part that should stop you. They went again anyway. The next morning, the 25th of July, with the memory of those dead men one day old, the Army sent the same bombers on the same perpendicular run over the same troops. Bradley was, by his own account, astonished and shocked by the short bombing on the 24th. He believed the airmen had betrayed the plan, but higher command wanted the offensive to go, the weather was clearing, and the ground forces were already committed. So Cobra went forward. In my view, this is the hinge of the whole moral question, and it is not the bombing itself. Accidents happen in war. It is the decision to repeat the exact circumstances that had just killed your own men 24 hours later, with your eyes open. Which brings us to the third charge, and to the morning itself. The bombers came in groups of 12, flying between 12 and 15,000 feet, and almost at once the plan began to come apart in the air. The artillery had fired colored smoke to mark the front line for the crews, but the smoke did not rise fast enough to be seen from altitude until the wind had already smeared it. The red marker smoke looked exactly like the red of bomb bursts and gun flashes on the ground below. Then the bombing itself began throwing up a wall of dust and smoke that drifted north, back over the American positions, so that the whole reference line the crews were supposed to bomb short of simply vanished under a brown cloud. One lead bombardier could not identify his aiming point and released by eye. Another could not find his landmarks. In one formation, the lead pilot called bombs away too early, and his entire unit dropped with him. To picture what that meant on the ground, you have to understand that the bombing was not one event, but a rolling hour, wave after wave, group after group, each one taking its aim from the smoke and the flashes of the group ahead. And, as the great cloud of dust and haze crept slowly north, back toward the American start line, each successive wave sighted on ground that was a little more obscured, a little more shifted, than the wave before it. Airmen have a name for this. They call it creep back, and it is the deadliest failure mode of mass bombing. The bombs walk backward toward the friendly line, a few yards with every group, because the aiming reference itself is drifting under the smoke. The men of the 30th Infantry Division were not struck by one clean mistake they could curse and forget. They were struck by a slow, grinding migration of the entire bombardment onto their heads, and it lasted long enough for the soldiers on the ground to understand exactly what was happening to them and be completely unable to do a single thing about it. You can survive one short stick of bombs by luck. You cannot outlast an hour of it walking steadily toward you. When the count was done, bombs from 35 heavy bombers and 42 medium bombers had fallen inside American lines. 77 aircraft bombing their own side. The 30th Infantry Division was hit hardest, the same division that had been hit the day before, the same division that had been hit in rehearsal. The 9th Infantry Division and the 4th Infantry Division took losses too. An entire battalion command group of the 47th Infantry was wiped out, except for its commander. The fire direction center of an artillery battalion was simply gone. And the official count, the figure Martin Blumenson gives in the United States Army's own history, is 111 Americans killed and 490 wounded on the 25th of July, with another 164 men so badly shocked they were out of the fight. And here is the cruelty layered on top of the cruelty. The infantry who had just been bombed by their own air force were not given time to absorb it. The ground attack was on a schedule, and the schedule did not move. Shocked, scattered, some of their leaders dead, the men of the assault divisions had to climb out of their holes almost at once and go forward into the smoke, into German positions that in places had ridden out the bombing better than the Americans had ridden out their own. The first day's gains were meager. One division measured its advance that afternoon in a couple of thousand yards, and it looked nothing like the clean breakthrough the planners had promised. If you had stood on that ground on the evening of the 25th of July and counted the American dead killed by American bombs against the few miserable fields taken, you would have called Cobra a failure, and you would have had every reason to. What saved it was not the bombing alone. It was the decision of one hard-driving corps commander, Major General Joe Collins, the man they called Lightning Joe, who looked at that confused and bloody first day and gambled. Instead of waiting to be sure the door had really been opened, he threw his armor forward on the evening of the 25th, betting that the German defense was more broken than it looked from the American side of the line. He turned out to be right. Within a day, the trickle became a flood. The German front west of St. Lo came apart at the seams, and the meager gains of that first afternoon turned into the breakout that would carry American tanks clear across France. The victory was real, but it was a near thing, and it was salvaged by one man's nerve as much as by any amount of tonnage, and none of that nerve could give back the men the bombs had already taken. Now, I promised you honesty about the numbers, and this audience checks the numbers, so let me flag the dispute directly rather than smooth it over. 111 killed and 490 wounded is the official Army figure, and it is the one I trust most, but it is not the only one in the literature. The historian Antony Beevor, in his book D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, gives 101 killed and 463 wounded for that day. You will also see the number 601 thrown around online as if it were a separate higher casualty count. It is not. 601 is simply the official killed and wounded added together, 111 plus 490, relabeled. I mention this because you will see it, and now you will know what it is. When the graphic goes on screen in this video, it will show both the official figure and Beevor's side by side, because that is the honest way to do it. For the aviation-minded among you, and I know you are out there, here is what that morning actually looked like in the air, because the details matter, and this channel does not get them wrong. The heavies were Boeing B-17s, the G model with the chin turret that had become standard by that summer, and consolidated B-24s. Behind them came the medium bombers, Martin B-26 Marauders, and Douglas A-20s. Ahead of them and around them worked the fighter bombers, mostly Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of Pete Quesada's 9th Tactical Air Command, the aircraft and the outfit that were about to make American close air support famous. Every one of those airplanes wore the black and white invasion stripes painted on just before the landings, still bright that July, and the national star and bar in insignia blue, not the red-bordered marking you will sometimes see wrongly slapped onto 1944 aircraft in films and thumbnails because the red surround had been gone since the previous autumn. And here is a detail that tells you just how little margin these planners were working with. Bradley had actually asked for light bombs, mostly 100-pound general-purpose bombs, roughly 7 of every 10 in the heavy loads, and he did it precisely because he did not want heavier bombs to crater the roads and fields his own tanks would have to cross within the hour. He was trying to make the bombardment gentler on the ground he needed to advance over, and it still tore his men apart. That is how thin the margin was. And somewhere in that storm of falling bombs in a slit trench near the front line of the 30th Infantry Division was Lieutenant General Lesley McNair. He had no operational reason to be that far forward. He was not commanding the battle. He had come up to the line as an observer to watch the divisions he had trained do the thing he had trained them for. A bomb landed squarely on his position. Omar Bradley, who saw the aftermath, wrote that it threw McNair's body 60 feet and mangled it beyond recognition, and that he could be identified only by the 3 stars of his rank still fixed to his collar. Some accounts say the body was thrown 80 feet rather than 60. It is a grim detail to have a discrepancy in, and I flag it only because I flag all of them, but the substance is not in dispute. The man who built the American army was torn apart by an American bomb, and the only way anyone knew it was him was by the medal on his collar. That is the prosecution's factual case. A danger named and accepted, a warning delivered in blood and ignored, a slaughter of one's own men, and among them the most senior American officer, to fall in the whole European war. But there is a 4th charge, and it is the one that gives this video its title, because what the Army did next was not a battlefield error at all. It was a choice made in headquarters in cold blood with time to think. The Army hid how he died. McNair was buried in Normandy the very next morning, in a near-secret ceremony with almost no one present. And when the War Department announced his death to the American public on the 27th of July, It said this: that General McNair had been killed by enemy fire while observing the action of our front line units. Enemy fire. There was no enemy fire. He had been killed by an American bomb, and the Army knew it. Why would the Army lie about the death of one of its own most distinguished soldiers? That is the real mystery here, and the answer runs deeper than simple embarrassment, though embarrassment was surely part of it. To understand it, you have to know the secret McNair was carrying, and this is where the story turns from a tragedy of the battlefield into something stranger and colder. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to this story, to the 30th Infantry Division, to the bomb groups that flew that morning. I want to do it justice, and doing it justice means telling you the second reason his death was hidden. When George Patton was pulled out of the notional command he had been holding and given a real army for the coming campaign, the Allies had a problem. For months they had been running the greatest deception in the history of warfare, an operation called Fortitude, and the heart of it was a phantom army, the First United States Army Group, supposedly massing in the southeast of England to cross the narrow part of the Channel and land at the Pas de Calais. This ghost army did not exist. It was inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic and double agents feeding lies to Berlin. But the Germans believed in it completely, and because they believed in it, they kept powerful forces waiting at Calais for an invasion that would never come, forces that were not in Normandy killing the men who had actually landed. That deception was worth divisions. It may have saved the invasion. You have to understand how elaborate this ghost was to see why the army guarded it as fiercely as it did. The Phantom Army Group was built out of almost nothing, and made to look like everything. Whole fields in the southeast of England were filled with inflatable rubber tanks and dummy landing craft made of canvas and scaffolding, laid out to be photographed by German reconnaissance aircraft. Fake radio networks chattered day and night, generating the electronic traffic of a huge army that was not there at all. And a ring of double agents, German spies who had been captured and turned and were now secretly working for the Allies, fed Berlin a steady, patient diet of confirming lies. One of them, a Spaniard the Germans trusted absolutely, convinced German intelligence so completely that even after the Normandy landings, the German High Command held its strongest armored reserves back near the Pas de Calais for weeks, still waiting for the real blow to fall there, the blow that was never coming. Every division the Germans kept sitting at Calais was a division not in Normandy killing American boys. That was the prize. That was what a single careless announcement about one dead general could put at risk. And a phantom army needs a commander whose name the Germans will recognize and respect. After Patton moved on, that role, the notional command of the Ghost Army, was quietly handed to Lesley McNair. That is the real reason he had crossed to France. Not to take command of a real army in the field, and I want to correct a common error here because you will read in more than one otherwise careful account that McNair had come to Europe to take command of the newly forming Ninth Army. That is wrong. The Ninth Army had a commander. McNair's secret assignment was the phantom one, and part of the grim logic of sending him up to the Normandy front as an observer was the hope that German intelligence would notice he was on the continent and draw exactly the wrong conclusion. Now you can see the box the army was in when he was killed. If they announced that the commander of the First United States Army Group had died at the Normandy front on the 25th of July, they risked telling German intelligence that this army group's commander was in Normandy and not in southeast England preparing to sail for Calais. Worse, they risked the Germans asking why a man supposedly commanding the invasion of Calais was standing in a foxhole in the wrong part of France. The whole deception could unravel from one honest obituary. So the death was suppressed, the burial was held in near secrecy, and a replacement, Lieutenant General John DeWitt, was rushed into the phantom role before the news went out. The official United States Army history says it as plainly as anything in the record. Because the news of General McNair's death might compromise Fortitude, he was buried secretly, with only senior officers in attendance. This is where the two reasons for the cover story braid together, and this is where I want to give you my honest read, because different historians weigh these two things differently. The official histories, Blumenson and also Forrest Pogue in his volume The Supreme Command, put the weight on Fortitude, on the deception. The journalistic accounts of how the story was managed put more weight on the plain embarrassment, on not wanting the American public to learn that its Air Force had killed a lieutenant general and 100 of his men. In my view, both are true, and they reinforced each other. The deception gave the Army a genuine, defensible wartime reason to keep quiet, and the embarrassment gave the Army every incentive to hunt for a cover story rather than simply say nothing. What you got in the end was not silence. It was a false statement. Enemy fire. And there is a meaningful difference between declining to reveal a secret and telling the public something you know to be untrue. I will say this too. And it is the one place I let myself point at the pattern you already know from your own lives. When an institution does something catastrophic to its own people, the first instinct is almost never the truth. It is to protect the story. The men who could be blamed reach for the version in which someone else is at fault, and the organization reaches for the version that protects the organization. You have seen this. You have watched it happen somewhere you worked, on a smaller scale, with lower stakes, when something went badly wrong and the energy in the building shifted from fixing it to managing how it looked. The Army in 1944 was the largest organization on Earth, and it behaved exactly the way organizations behave. It just had a general's body to account for while it did. Here is where the false statement started to fall apart. And to the Army's limited credit, it did not hold the lie for long. Reporters in London were already hearing that American bombs had done this. On the 2nd of August, the War Department corrected itself and admitted that General McNair had died from one of our own bombs, which fell short. On the 3rd of August, the military analyst Hanson Baldwin wrote in the New York Times that the first announcement had been a grave mistake since the truth was already circulating. A few days later, a Washington newspaper condemned the War Department for a kind of disingenuousness the public had grown used to. So the truth did come out, within a couple of weeks, under pressure. But the instinct, in the first hours with the body still warm, had been to lie. And there's something worth noticing in that sequence, because it changes how you read the correction. The truth did not come out because the Army decided that honesty was owed to the dead men's families. It came out because reporters in London already had it, and holding the lie any longer would have cost the Army more in credibility than the truth would cost it in embarrassment. The correction was a calculation, not a confession. And the deeper secret, the real reason the death had been hidden in the first place, the Phantom Army and McNair's role at the head of it, stayed buried for the rest of the war and long after. The public was eventually told that American bombs had killed him. The public was not told why the announcement had been held back, or that the general had been the ghost commander of an army that did not exist, or that a replacement had been quietly slotted into that fiction before the news ever went out. That part stayed classified for years after the guns fell silent. The families got a corrected cause of death. They did not get the whole story. Almost no one did, for a very long time. That is the case against. Now I owe you the defense, given fairly, because this audience does not want a hit job, and the men who made these decisions deserve to have their side put as strongly as it can be put. Start with the hardest truth for the prosecution. It worked. Whatever else you say about Operation Cobra, it did the thing it was designed to do, and it did it decisively. The German division directly in the path of the bombing was the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best armored formations in the German army, commanded by Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein. After the war, Bayerlein described what the bombing did to his men in words that have never been bettered. He said the planes kept coming overhead like a conveyor belt, that his front lines looked like the surface of the moon, and that at least 70% of his troops were out of action, dead, wounded, driven mad, or stunned senseless. His communications were cut. His command was shattered. A first-rate German armored division was, for the critical hours, simply not there. That is what bought the breakout. That is what saved, in the longer run, the far larger number of American lives that a slow, grinding advance through the hedgerows would have cost. The defense's core argument is that the 1,100 casualties of the short bombing, dreadful as they were, have to be set against the tens of thousands who would have fallen taking that ground the slow way. I think that argument is serious, and it cannot be waved away. But I also think it needs a caveat that the aviation histories insist on, and this audience will want, so let me give it. The picture of Panzer Lehr as annihilated is partly Bayerlein's own post-war drama. The historian Ian Gooderson, in his study Air Power at the Battlefront, makes the case that heavy bombers were far less effective at physically destroying tanks than the legends claim, that most of the armored vehicles later examined had not, in fact, been knocked out from the air. What the bombing did, and did superbly, was not destruction so much as disruption. It severed communication, it broke command and control, it turned a coordinated defense into scattered groups of shocked men. The division still had running tanks after the bombing. What it did not have, for those crucial hours, was the ability to fight as a division. That distinction matters, and it is exactly the kind of distinction this channel exists to draw. And to be scrupulously fair to the defense, the German division did not simply cease to exist. By the accounts the skeptics cite, the Panzer Lehr Division still had something on the order of 30 running tanks and assault guns, and thousands of men on its rolls in the days after the bombing. What it had lost was not so much its equipment as its nerve and its cohesion, and, in the fast exploitation that followed, Cohesion was the thing that decided everything. The defense would also remind you, correctly, that Cobra did not happen in a vacuum. All through that July, the Allies had been reaching for their heavy bombers to break the deadlock at Caen in the great British attack called Goodwood, again and again, because nothing else was cracking the German line, and the fear of a permanent stalemate was real. Bradley was not a reckless man improvising a slaughter for its own sake. He was a careful, cautious officer who had watched a month of his infantry die by the meter in the hedgerows, and had concluded, with genuine anguish, that a terrible fast price was better than a worse slow one. When you set his decision inside that summer, it looks less like arrogance and more like a commander choosing between two bad options and picking the one he believed would end the killing soonest. That is the strongest form of the defense, and it deserves to be stated at full strength before anyone rushes to judgment. Now the defense of the men individually. Take Bradley first. Bradley's position, which he held to for the rest of his life and set down in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, was that he had been betrayed. He had asked for a parallel approach along the road, and the airmen had flown perpendicular over his troops, and had not told him they were going to. He used hard words. He called it a serious breach of good faith. He said, in effect, that the airmen had lied to him. If Bradley was right, then the blood was on the air commanders, not on him, and the man who planned the ground operation was as much a victim of the airmen's decision as the infantry were. And the airmen have a defense, too, just as strong. Their position was that the perpendicular approach was never something they hid. It was discussed openly at the planning conference on the 19th of July. It was, they argued, the only physically possible way to deliver that much tonnage in that little time, and they had said so. In their understanding, Bradley had accepted the risk of short bombing no matter which way the aircraft approached, because there was no approach that made 1,500 bombers over your own troops safe. From the airmen's chairs, they had told the ground commander the truth, he had accepted it, and then after the disaster, he had gone looking for someone else to carry it. So who was right? Here, the official history is quietly devastating to the neat version of either man's story. Blumenson's reconstruction of that planning conference concludes that the direction of approach was discussed, that it provoked considerable argument, and that it was never actually settled. There was no firm meeting of the minds. Bradley walked away believing one thing, and the airmen walked away believing another, and no one nailed it down in writing. And men died in the gap between two honest memories of the same conversation. That is not a betrayal. In some ways, it is worse than a betrayal. It is the ordinary, bureaucratic, fatal failure to make sure that everyone in a room agreed on the one thing that could not afford to be misunderstood. The last piece of the defense is the one I find least convincing, but I will put it fairly. It is the argument for the cover story itself, the enemy fire statement. The defense is that this was wartime, that fortitude was real and vital, that a great deal more than one general's reputation was riding on keeping the Germans confused about the Phantom Army, and that, in that context, a temporary falsehood about the cause of one death was a small and defensible price to keep a war-winning secret intact. On its own terms, as a matter of operational security, that argument has real weight. The deception was worth protecting. Which brings me to the verdict. And I want to be honest with you about what kind of verdict this is going to be, because on this channel, when a story is genuinely unresolved, I do not pretend to resolve it for you. I give you my read, and then I hand you the harder question, because it is yours to answer, not mine. Here is my read on the parts I think can be settled. On the question of who betrayed whom, I do not think anyone did. I think Bradley's charge of duplicity, understandable as it is from a grieving, furious commander, does not survive the record. The approach was argued and left unresolved, and Bradley bears real responsibility for the thing he most wanted to blame on others, because it was Bradley who insisted on the dangerously short safety line, 800 yards to start, 1,500 in the end, against airmen who begged for 3,000 and warned him even that was not enough. The military historian John Sullivan, writing in the journal Parameters, laid a good deal of the blame at Bradley's feet for exactly this, the impossible compression of time and space that he demanded, and the airmen tried to warn him against. When you set the safety margin that low, you have decided, in advance, that some of your own men will die. Bradley decided that. He was not only a victim of the airmen, he was the author of the conditions. And there is one more set of Bradley's fingerprints on this that the record makes plain, and that his memoir works hard to keep you from noticing. It was Bradley who chose to renew the attack on the 25th of July after the dead of the 24th. That was not an airman's decision. That was the ground commander looking at his own casualties from a botched rehearsal, understanding exactly how the short bombing had happened, and deciding that the operation mattered more than the warning. A commander is allowed to make that choice. Great commanders sometimes have to make it, and history often thanks them for it. But having made it, Bradley does not then get to lay the entire weight of the outcome on the men who flew the aircraft. Responsibility for Cobra's dead is shared up and down the chain, and Bradley's share of it is considerably larger than a reader of his memoir would ever guess. And on the question of accountability, the record is stark. No one was disciplined. Not the airmen, not the planners, not the ground command. The official reports found no fault with the senior commanders. A lieutenant general and more than 100 soldiers were killed by their own side, twice in 2 days. And the institutional conclusion was that no one was to blame. In my view, that is the quietest scandal in the whole affair. Quieter than the cover story, and it is the most familiar. The system protected itself, decided it had done its best, and moved on to the victory. But now the question I cannot answer for you, the one the graphic will end on, the one I want in the comments. Cobra worked. The short bombing was, in the coldest possible accounting, part of the price of a victory that shortened the war in the West and saved, on any reasonable estimate, far more American lives than it cost. So, was it worth it? Was a commander right to accept, in advance, the near certainty that his own bombs would kill his own men because the prize was big enough? And once those men were dead, once a general lay torn apart in a French field, was the army right to tell their country a comforting lie about how they fell, even for a few weeks, even to guard a genuine secret? Two of the men closest to this could not agree. Dwight Eisenhower, sick at heart, swore he would never again turn heavy bombers loose over his own troops in a tactical role, that he had given the green light this one time and it was the last. Omar Bradley looked at the same field and concluded that Cobra had not failed, that it had succeeded, that they had broken through. Same ground, same dead. Two different verdicts. I'm not going to overrule either of them for you. I'm going to ask you which one you would have given. And before you answer, I want you to sit with how genuinely hard it is, because this is not a case with an obvious right side, and I distrust anyone who tells you that it is. If you say the price was too high, that no breakthrough on Earth is worth knowingly bombing your own men, then you have to answer for the far greater number of Americans who would have died grinding through those hedgerows the slow way. Men every bit as real as the ones the bombs killed, whose deaths you simply would not have had to stand there and watch. And if you say the price was worth it, that Cobra saved more than it spent, and the arithmetic is the arithmetic, then you have to be willing to look Lesley McNair's widow in the eye and the families of the 30th Infantry Division and tell them their men were an acceptable loss, killed by their own side, and that their country was right to hand them a comforting untruth about it first. Neither answer is clean. Both of them cost something. That is what makes this a real question and not a slogan, and it is exactly why I will not tie it up in a bow and hand it back to you solved. Some things in war do not resolve. To my mind, this is one of them. Let me put the numbers together in one place, the way a closing argument should, because the scale of this is easy to lose in the storytelling. Over 2 days, the 24th and 25th of July, 1944, American bombs killed roughly 136 Americans and wounded more than 600, counting both days, and left the official 2-day casualty figure at close to 900 men. On the main day, of the 1,581 heavy bombers sent out, 1,503 dropped their loads, along with more than 380 medium bombers and over 500 fighter bombers. All told, they put down more than 4,000 tons of bombs in about an hour into a target box only a few thousand yards deep. 77 of those aircraft bombed their own side. On the German side, the Panzer Lehr Division, which had gone into that morning with only about 2,200 combat troops on its main line and perhaps 45 armored vehicles, lost around 1,000 men to the bombing, and had, by its own commander's account, 70% of its forward troops knocked out of the fight. And the man at the center of this story, Lieutenant General Lesley McNair, became the highest-ranking American killed by enemy or friendly fire in the European theater, and one of only a small handful of Americans of 3-star rank or higher to die in the entire war. To give that its proper weight, of the millions of Americans who served, only a tiny few of comparable seniority were lost in the whole of the Second World War, and McNair stood at the very top of that grim short list in Europe. This was the man who had overseen the creation of something like 90 American combat divisions, the entire ground army that won the war in the West. He was killed by one bomb, one of many thousands dropped that morning, released by an American crew that never knew he was down there in the dirt beneath them. 10 years later, in 1954, an act of Congress promoted McNair posthumously to full general, 4 stars. And here's a small, telling coda that says everything about how thoroughly he was forgotten. His headstone in the American cemetery in Normandy still read Lieutenant General for more than half a century, because the body that maintains those graves never knew about the promotion. It was not corrected to general until the year 2010. The man who built the Army lay under the wrong rank in a foreign field for 56 years. Now let me leave the numbers and tell you what this cost, because numbers are where these stories start, not where they end. Think about the men in the 30th Infantry Division. They were bombed on the 24th. They buried friends, and then they were told to go back out on the 25th and stand under the same bombers again. And they did it, because that is what they were ordered to do. The bombers killed more of them. There is a kind of courage in that which is almost unbearable to think about. The courage to lie back down in the same field where your own side had just killed the man next to you. One company commander, quoted in the official history, described the waves coming in closer and closer, the dust drifting back over his own men, putting out all the orange identification smoke they had and knowing it did no good, and then the bombs walking right up onto his position. The shock, he said, was awful. That is a man watching his own Air Force come for him and being able to do nothing but press his face into French dirt and wait. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle was there, caught in it, lying in that same storm, and Pyle had seen as much of the war as any American alive. He called it the most sustained, horrible experience he had ever been through. An Associated Press photographer named George Bead Irvin was killed alongside the soldiers, and Lesley McNair, 61 years old, a man who could have run the war from a desk in Washington and instead insisted on being at the front to see his soldiers fight, died in a hole in the ground so completely that the only thing left to identify him by was the medal on his collar. There is a bitter irony in the way McNair died that I have not been able to shake, and it belongs here more than anywhere. As the man who built the American Army's training system, McNair had been a fierce believer in realism. He insisted that soldiers train under live fire, that they crawl beneath real machine gun bullets and through real explosions, because he was convinced that men who had never heard the real thing would freeze or break the first time they did. That philosophy cost lives before the war ever reached them. Men died on his training ranges, in accidents, under live rounds, and McNair accepted those deaths as the hard price of readiness, the very same brutal arithmetic that would later be used to justify the bombing that killed him. He had already been wounded once at the front in Tunisia, and he was partly deaf from a lifetime spent around artillery. He did not have to go up to the line in Normandy. A man of his rank and importance had every reason in the world to stay back at a headquarters. He went forward because he had spent his entire career sending other men forward, and he believed he owed it to them to stand on the same ground. And it killed him. And the war was not finished with his family. Less than 2 weeks after Lesley McNair died in that French field, his only son, Colonel Douglas McNair, serving as a senior staff officer with an infantry division in the Pacific, was killed by a Japanese sniper on the island of Guam. A father and his only son, dead within days of each other on opposite sides of the world in the same terrible summer month. One woman lost her husband and her only child almost in the same breath. When you ask what all of this cost, that is a piece of the answer that no casualty table will ever show you. Not a statistic. A family ended. He was buried the next morning with a handful of officers standing in the Normandy weather. No band, no rifle volley, nothing that might draw attention, because attention was the one thing the Army could not afford. Omar Bradley was there. So were Courtney Hodges and George Patton and the airman Pete Casada. Dwight Eisenhower was not, whatever some accounts claim. He had crossed to Normandy the day of the bombing and gone back to England that same evening, carrying the weight of what he had authorized. If your father or grandfather flew with the 8th Air Force or the 9th that summer, or fought with the 30th Infantry Division in the hedgerows, or worked the flight line that sent those bombers out, I would like to hear about it. Those stories are the ones that outlast every official history, and they matter here more than most. Drop them in the comments. Here is where I will leave it. Operation Cobra was a victory, one of the most important the American Army ever won, and it was purchased in part with the lives of the men the operation was meant to save, killed by the weapons meant to protect them, and then explained to their country with a lie the Army told to guard a secret and to spare itself. The victory was real. The dead were real. And the gap between how they died and how their country was first told they died is the thing I cannot quite make peace with, and do not want you to make peace with too easily either. Lieutenant General Lesley McNair built an army, and that army killed him, and then for a few days it told the world the enemy had done it. What you make of that is yours to decide. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.